Chapter 11, Fiscal Policy. Fiscal policy. The Keynesian theory of macro instability practically mandates government intervention. If aggregate demand is too little, unemployment rises. If aggregate demand is too much, inflation rises. If the market cannot correct these imbalances, then the federal government must. Fiscal policy is very much a Keynesian approach. Most fiscal policy in today's world is Keynesian. It's been Keynesian really since Reagan left office in 1988. All the presidents since, Bush Sr., Clinton, Bush Jr., and Obama, have all been Keynesians when it comes to fiscal policy. They believed that heavy government involvement in the economy would help the economy, make the economy better, and they did this through practice. Bush Sr. would historically get into arguments with Alan Greenspan, the chairman of the Federal Reserve at the time, thinking that Greenspan wasn't doing enough to stimulate the economy. In fact, Bush actually blamed Greenspan for his failure to be reelected in '92. Clinton, while being fairly conservative in many of his economic approaches, still felt that it was the government's responsibility to stimulate the economy, and he did this actually by lowering taxes at one point and controlling spending. He felt that by having the government reduce spending temporarily, it could stimulate the economy, and it did in the late 90s. Of course, the tech boom helped that as well. Bush Jr., after Clinton, really tried to stimulate the economy through government spending. He raised government spending dramatically during his presidency and created a money bubble through a lot of the spending, and there were other factors involved, of course. But by keeping interest rates low, which Greenspan did through the first 5 or 6 years of the Bush Jr. presidency, while Greenspan was still chairman of the Fed, interest rates were kept low, government spending was kept high, overstimulated the economy, which led us to a point where when we did reduce spending, when aggregate demand did fall, when the mortgage crisis hit, that we had quite a ways to fall. And then, of course, Obama has tried to control the economy through, once again, another massive spending increase, triple that of Bush, and has also tried to stimulate the economy with the stimulus package back from 2009, as well as other things that he has done. In this chapter, we examine fiscal policy tools, so we're going to get into the details of how this is typically done. The core issues: can government spending and tax policies ensure full employment? What policy actions will help fight inflation? What are the risks of government intervention? So what fiscal policy is the use of government taxes and spending to alter macroeconomic outcomes. So it's what the government does to play with the economy. First, taxes and spending. The federal government collects nearly $3 trillion a year in tax revenues. Of course, this went way down about 5 years ago. This was down to about $2.2 trillion, and now we're creeping our way back up to $3 trillion, nearly half of which comes from individual income taxes. So most of government revenue comes from income taxes. Less than half of government expenditures go to government purchases of goods and services. The rest are income transfers. And remember, income transfers are things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, which is at the state level, food stamps, welfare, unemployment, disability, all are categorized as income transfers. Fiscal policy. These tax and spending powers can greatly influence aggregate demand. Government can alter AD by purchasing fewer or more goods or services, raising or lowering taxes, or changing the level of income transfers. The book, as you can see, makes the statement that government can alter aggregate demand. What's really up for debate right now, especially after the last 4 or 5 years, is how much can they really change aggregate demand. Alan Greenspan famously said that the economy, the ups and downs of the economy, is determined by the emotions of the average consumer, not by government action, as many people would have us believe. That an emotional consumer, the decisions the average consumer makes control the economy, not government interaction. And this really fits in with what happened in 2008, where Bush came on TV and scared everybody, telling us our whole economy was in danger, and we didn't really know why. We didn't know what was going on because it wasn't affecting the average consumer. But he scared us, then the news scared us, and so we all stopped spending. It was an emotional response to what we saw on TV and what everyone was saying. We stopped spending. It was the emotional response of the consumer that slowed the economy down. And right now, in the middle of 2013, our economy is starting to come back. It's because is the government doing something different right now than they did a year ago? Absolutely not. The reason is consumers are becoming more confident. The consumer is starting to get excited about spending again, and that's getting the economy going a little. Fiscal stimulus. If a recessionary GDP gap exists, a fiscal stimulus could be used to deliver the economy to full employment. So the government, what it's saying is the government could do something to stimulate the economy. Of course, we tried that in 2009, where we passed a nearly $1 trillion stimulus package. Some tax cuts, some spending, to get the economy going again. Did it work? No. Empirically, no. There's no evidence to suggest that the stimulus in 2009 helped us at all. When it was passed by Congress, there was a set of measures given for that stimulus, that a set of an unemployment grid, so how the unemployment rate would change if the stimulus was passed and how it would change if it wouldn't pass. And it was passed, and unemployment ended up being worse than the worst case scenario given if it didn't pass. So things were actually worse than they anticipated they would be if they didn't vote for it at all. The reality is we don't know how different stimulus attempts will affect the economy. In 2009, the consumer wasn't emotionally ready to start spending again. So when the government spent, and the government gave people additional money through tax cuts, the stimulus did both, it didn't result in that how shall I word this? It didn't result in getting that economic wheel turning, where people would start spending, and when people start spending, businesses can start hiring, and when businesses start hiring, more people are employed, and those people can start spending, and getting that whole thing going. It didn't succeed because people weren't ready to spend. The tax savings that people received, a lot of it was saved. The money that the government spent, well, business owners were still too scared and apprehensive to use that money to grow their businesses, to hire new people. They didn't want to hire someone and then when the stimulus money ran out have to fire them again, so they didn't hire. And it quite simply ended up being $1 trillion wasted in terms of its help with the recession at the time. It didn't work. Using government spending. Increased government spending as a form of fiscal stimulus. All new government spending will have a multiplied impact on aggregate demand. So that's that economic wheel I talked about on the last slide. That's the multiplier. Desired fiscal stimulus. Too little fiscal stimulus, the economy may stay in a recession. Too much, it may lead to excessive spending and inflation. There's a third option here, which is what happened in 2009. The consumer ignores the stimulus, the stimulative effects of the stimulus. The money doesn't start the economic wheel turning, or in this particular case, the multiplier. They like to use that term here. It didn't happen in 2009, and so there really is a third option that historic macroeconomic policy never discussed, where you give people a bunch of money, they just don't do anything with it. We've always relied on the American consumer being willing to spend a lot of money and being willing to spend most of the money that they have. Tax cuts. The fiscal stimulus can come from inducing increased autonomous consumption or investment spending. And governments can lower taxes to try and stimulate the economy. Historically, this has worked. This started under Kennedy. Kennedy was the first president to listen to economists and reduce taxes to try and get us out of a recession. It worked. Economists really carried a lot of weight after that, and presidents have listened to economists ever since, and there have been many examples of lowering of tax rates leading to economic growth. The biggest one was under Reagan, where he lowered taxes early in his presidency, and it led to a long period of growth. It doesn't always work, though, because once again, the consumer has to be willing to spend the money that the new money that they're getting by not having to pay as many taxes. So if their take-home check every month is now 5% bigger, if they're not willing to spend it, there's no stimulus. So the consumer needs to have confidence in the economy as well as have more money in their pockets. Tax cuts, we just talked about how that would work, so we're going to keep on moving. Since there's no initial input of spending, tax cuts have a little less stimulus than government spending. That's true. It's not new money in the economy. It sort of is in a roundabout kind of way, in that tax cuts will typically grow the deficit, and to pay the deficit we all often end up in having to borrow money from ourselves, which ends up really being printing money in some ways. So but that takes a while, and because of that, there not being any new money in the system, and because people will not spend all of their tax cut, they will save some of it. Tax cuts are not as an efficient method of growing the economy as government spending, stimulating the economy than government. Increased transfers. You can increase transfer payments to increase aggregate demand. This can be done by giving people more money for unemployment, more money for Social Security, more money for welfare, more qualifiers for food stamps. This gives more people more money, and those people will usually spend money because they don't have a lot, and they typically are not in a position to save, so they'll typically spend whatever they get, and that will in fact in many cases keep the economy going by keeping the stores that those people frequent in business and keep them hiring and so forth. Okay, fiscal restraint. If an inflationary GDP gap exists, a fiscal restraint could be used to return the economy to full employment. Fiscal restraint would be a tax hike, spending cuts. These are things that are going to slow the economy down. So if we start getting too much inflation, so if all the stimulus we're giving the economy right now in 2013 is too much, we could raise taxes or decrease spending in order to, and that would supposedly slow the economy down. Once again, in the last couple of years, a lot of these traditional rules that we learn in macroeconomics have not always held true. There's been a large push there was a large push in 2012 towards increasing taxes. The Democrats wanted to increase taxes on those making $250,000 or more, and the Republicans wanted to decrease spending. Both of those are ways to restrain the economy. Those are fiscal restraints. But they both wanted to do those things for political reasons, even though we were struggling as an economy. And we did. We cut spending, and we increased taxes at the beginning of 2013. And according to what you've just learned here in Macroeconomics Chapter 11, that should have hurt our economy. The economy should have slowed down. In part it did. Our GDP has shrunk. The growth rate of GDP has gone down. It hasn't actually shrunk, but the growth rate has slowed down. But all other economic indicators are very strong. Unemployment has continued to go down. The stock market is setting record highs. Building starts are up. Consumer confidence is high, which leads you to believe that growth in GDP will follow. So what happened? Why didn't this work? It goes back to that consumer confidence issue. consumers are feeling more comfortable reinvesting the money that they've saved, reinvesting their money into the economy, because they feel the government is being more responsible and not reducing taxes and spending more and creating a larger deficit. That made many people very uncomfortable. They didn't want to buy into that economy. Once the government got a little more conservative in their approach, people decided to open up their wallets and start spending again. It's very interesting how that happened, exactly opposite to the historic fiscal restraint approach that you would that you read about in the book. It'll be interesting to see in future editions of the book if, in fact, they maybe change it. But for now, I mean, if there's any test or quiz questions, answer according to the book, answer according to the PowerPoint. But it's very important to know that it seems like things may be changing. Desired fiscal restraint: if there's too little, the economy, it could continue to be inflationary. If there's too much, it could lead to decreased spending. Budget cuts: decreased government spending is a form of fiscal restraint. Reduced government spending will have a multiplied impact on aggregate demand. So if the government reduces spending, the idea is that there will be less money entering the economy from the government, and those people who are receiving that money wouldn't spend as much, which would keep the economy from growing quickly. You can cut government expenditures to initiate the multiplier process to achieve the desired fiscal restraint. So the more you cut the government, the more you're going to hold back the economy. And so if the economy really starts to boom, and we're in a little bit of a danger of that now, that because we've been pumping all this money into the economy, that we've been creating so much new money, we've been spending so much, that we could enter into a time of inflation. We could enter into a time of a runaway economy, and then in that case it would be up to the government to try and slow things down, because the government has created a situation where they have sped up the economy and grown the economy. According to market theory, and we're not dealing a lot with market theory in this chapter, but according to market theory, you would never have to restrain the economy since you would never falsely stimulate it in the first place. So there's not a market solution for this. Well, ultimately the market would most likely fix all of this, but it would take quite a bit of time. So the government if the government overstimulates the economy, it then is easiest to hold the economy back with government action. Tax hikes. So if you increase taxes, people will have less money to spend, and that will slow the economy. Reduce transfers. Give people less in food stamps, less in welfare, less in Social Security, and that will slow the economy down because those people will have less to spend. This option is politically unpopular. This is important. It's politically unpopular piece. A lot of things in this that we mentioned are politically unpopular. Will transfers ever be reduced? Because that would be a very politically unpopular decision. Will tax rates ever go up by a large margin or down by a large margin? Both those decisions would be very politically unpopular. It's going to be very hard at this day and age with our information society and our 24-hour news cycle and how aware people are of everything. It's going to be very interesting to see if large changes ever happen again. It used to be large changes were fairly common in transfer payments, tax cuts, tax increases, all those things. Now people are much more involved. Crowding out. The government starts borrowing more money, and we were, in a sense, reducing the ability of the private sector to borrow money. And if the private sector can't borrow money, the average citizen can't borrow money because the government's borrowing all the money, that'll slow the economy down because they don't have as much money to invest. Fiscal policy problems. Time lags. Okay, with any of the things we've discussed, there's an issue with it taking a long time. These things are not overnight, they're not instant, and sometimes, as we've learned, they don't work at all. So at what point do you know if something did or didn't work? Is it a month? Is it a year? Is it 3 years? It's hard to know. We don't really have a set guide for that. We don't have a cheat sheet that says how long we should wait for these things to happen. And nothing is too fast on when it comes to fiscal policy and how quickly things get fixed, especially when you consider how long it may take. Especially when you consider how long it may take for some of these things to trickle down to the lower levels. Another problem: pork barrel politics. Congress likes to attach pet projects onto important bills, and a lot of times they'll do it for political reasons. Almost always they do it for political reasons. They'll try and get stuff for their own district put in. They'll add on pet projects to get them reelected onto important bills. And if one party says, hey, we're not voting for it because you put all that pork on it, you tacked on all these extra taxes, and you put a toxic waste approval for this company onto a children's lunch bill, things that are completely unrelated, but yet if somebody is hesitant in signing it, they're going to be called obstructionists, and it can hurt them to getting elected the next time. So it really creates a big mess. So pork barrel politics always slow the process down. Public versus private spending. Two camps have really emerged on the public-private spending. One camp favors government solutions to problems. The other camp is concerned about government being too big, and that solutions are better left to the private sector. When these two camps fight, nothing happens. Of course, when you really think about that, nothing happening is really in favor of the market folks, the folks who want to let the market have it. If they obstruct and keep things from happening, they're getting what they want, which is the government not doing anything and just letting the market work itself out. So they definitely have the advantage there. And we've seen that in the last couple of years here since the Republicans took control of Congress in 2010. There has not been very many major pieces of legislation. In fact, records are being set for some of the smallest amounts of legislation ever passed by the U.S. government in the last couple of years. Now, those that are pro-government will say this is obstructionist and causing major economic stress by not letting the government fix things. Those that favor a market approach, they're more likely to say, hey, because we haven't let you guys mess up the economy with more government interaction, the economy's rebounding and things are actually going very well right now. Finally, the camp that favors government solutions to problems, they would want an increase in government spending to cover aggregate demand where there isn't enough demand. The government should spend more. If aggregate demand goes too fast, they would want tax hikes. Those more interested in a market approach, they would rather cut taxes to cover an AD shortfall. So if the economy's not going well, increase the amount of market forces that could correct the problem. So to increase the power of the market, you would give more money to the people through tax cuts, and they would reduce government spending to cover AD excess. So if the economy was too strong, they would just slow down the spending to slow things down. All right, that's it for Chapter 11. We'll be back for Chapter 12.